Does the name Horace Brodsky ring a bell? No? Well, don't worry, I'll tell you about him anyway. He was Australian-born, and in the years before and after the First World War, he was on the cutting edge of the European art scene, exhibiting with the likes of Picasso, Augustus John, Wyndham Lewis and David Bomberg. He died in London in 1969, and despite his achievements, he's hardly known at all in his home country. But an art enthusiast, Henry Liu, has published a book on Brodsky, which he hopes will change all that. Here's Greg Newbold.
Henry Liu is an eye surgeon who, for the past 20 years, has found his spare time taken up in browsing through art galleries and antique shops. 12 years ago, he walked into Chris Deutsch's gallery in Melbourne and discovered a painting by Horace Brodsky. From the name and the style of painting, Dr. Liu assumed Brodsky to be a Russian émigré who painted in Paris at the turn of the century.
But Chris then informed me that he was an Australian, and his art was so different from any other Australian art that I'd ever seen that I really became fascinated in him and started to try and find out as much information as I could about him. And the more I found out, the more interesting the saga became.
Brodsky, Horace, son of Morris, brother of Leon, Vivian and Alfred. Father Brodsky founded the Melbourne newspaper Table Talk. Leon founded the Australian Theatre Society. Vivian was one of the world's first industrial affairs reporters and a war correspondent for the Sydney Daily Mirror. Alfred helped found the Communist Party of Australia and became the first solicitor for the ACTU. And Horace, born in Melbourne in 1885, painter and writer, one of the first to practice lino cutting, and with his friend and fellow artist Gordia Breshka, pursue the skill of line drawing.
He and Gordia Breshka really, in that technique, predate to a large extent even Picasso and Matisse, who made this art technique quite famous in the 1930s.
Having moved to London with his family, the largely self-taught artist held his first solo exhibition in 1911. It was a success, and in 1912 he became the first Australian-born painter to have a work selected for the Venice Biennale.
Shortly after that, he cracked it on the London avant-garde art scene and mixed with a lot of the prominent painters of the time and got admitted quite early in the piece to the London group. And in the London group he exhibited with people like Sickert, Augustus John, Wyndham Lewis, Jacob Epstein, Henry Gordia Breshka, Mark Gertler. They're all name pieces in English art. They're sort of as famous as people say like Streeton and Roberts in Australian art. In New York he exhibited in mixed exhibitions with people like Picasso, Vlaminck, Mary Laurentienne and also Maurice Prendergast, who's one of the leading American painters. He did posters for Maurice Maeterlinck at a time when Maeterlinck was already a Nobel laureate. He also did covers for Ezra Pound, Eugene O'Neill, Theodore Dreiser, Upton Sinclair, Alexei Tolstoy, quite a wide variety of people. And perhaps his most widely seen work of all is the end papers for the series of books called The Modern Library.
Brodsky's work is here in the National Gallery of Victoria, it's in the National Gallery in Canberra and in all other state galleries. He's to be found in the Tate Gallery in the British Museum and in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. As well, he's represented in dozens of smaller galleries and private collections. But for all that, he's largely unrecognised in Australia.
I think he suffers from being the Australian abroad. He's sort of the person a bit without a country. In England he's regarded as the Australian who was on the fringe of our modern movement, and in Australia he's regarded as the Australian who left Australia and never came back.
Brodsky spent more time writing articles supporting his artist friends like Gordia Breshka and David Bomberg than he did on pushing his own art. He was poor and often depressed. In 1962, Australian curator Robert Campbell took an exhibition of modern Australian works to London. During the show, so the story goes, Campbell's wife Jean was approached by an old man who was quite bitter that none of his works was included in the exhibition.
She thought he was just really a nut, I suppose, and she took his details anyway, and she then said she went to libraries and looked him up and came to the conclusion, yes, he was right, and he should be there. And interestingly, the Beaverbrook Press printed a book the year later, largely based on that exhibition, promoting Australian art in London, and in fact they included Horace in the book, even though he wasn't in the exhibition.
Henry Liu's book on Brodsky has prompted the Jewish Museum of Australia to mount an exhibition of the artist's work in Melbourne in March next year. And it seems Brodsky is finally to get public recognition overseas. A major travelling exhibition is planned for England in 1989.
That's it for another summer edition. Take care and good night.